Hello and welcome. My name is Dr. Gerard Toal, and this is a lecture on Wendy Browns' book Walled States, Waning Sovereignty, which was published by Zone Books. Now, this book is work of political theory, and Wendy Brown is a professor of political theory at the University of California in Berkeley. This book is a book that she published in 2010, and she has subsequently published a book Undoing the Demos, Neoliberalism Stealth Revolution, from Zone Books also. All right, let's talk a little bit about this book. So even though it was published in 2010, it is extremely relevant to the contemporary period, and that's one of the reasons why I assigned it. So let's talk about how the book is organized. There's 4 chapters. It begins by looking at certain kind of empirics and paradoxes, as she sees it, of sovereignty in the contemporary period. And then there is the core theoretical discussion in chapter 2 of various political theorists and thinkers on the question of sovereignty. Then chapter 3 deals with the question of subjects and subjectification, the making of subjects, the making of the polity in conditions where you have states that are engaged in the construction of border walls. And then chapter 4 is a reading of the desire and need for border walls, even though they manifestly do not fulfill the particular purposes that they're meant to fulfill. Why nevertheless do we still have borders and this desire for it? And she provides an analysis of this using some psychoanalytic theory, so you have that particular discussion at the end of the book. Now, the book throughout is a dialogue with, in particular, Carl Schmitt, and to a lesser extent, Giorgio Agamben. There's also discussion of the work of Michael Hart and Antonio Negri as well. Besides, there's also kind of discussion of the classics of political theory. Now, Carl Schmitt was a Nazi-era political thinker, a critic of liberalism, and someone whose work has enjoyed a revival over the last 25 years or so. In particular, the book Political Theology, which is, all of these are rather short books, but the book Political Theology looks at the ways in which the contemporary modern understandings of sovereignty are underpinned by theological understandings. Schmitt, you should know, was a conservative Catholic himself, and he was particularly sensitive to the ways in which God and notions of the religious work themselves out even in ostensibly secular societies. Schmitt is famous for his book, The Concept of the Political, which he defines as the determination of friend and enemies. And then there's another book, The Nomos of the Earth, which is also discussed by Wendy Brown, and that is one that came out later, and it is very much about the geopolitical and the bounding of the earth, and that's an inspiration for her work as well. So there's a particular dialogue with Schmitt's work. Now, because Schmitt is a conservative thinker who endorsed Nazism, that does not mean that therefore her work does the same, or her work is necessarily tainted in any way by that. In actuality, what she's seeking to do is to take on this critic of liberalism and look at his particular ideas. Martin Heidegger's another kind of figure too, and the ideas that the arguments that they're making are in and of themselves extremely important and separate from the particular person. So that's important to keep in mind. Now there is a discussion of Agamben, because Agamben was someone who helped stimulate the revival of Schmidt's work by going back and looking at it and finding notions such as the state of exception and so on and so forth. Antonio Negri and Michael Hart in their book Empire and another book Multitude are coming out of a more Marxist tradition, but they're also engaging with these thinkers. Now, Foucault is in the background, and the idea of biopolitics, which we've discussed already, is in the background, and that's something that Agamben addresses explicitly, Antonio Negri and Michael Hart also address explicitly too. Okay, so let's talk about the book and talk about that sort of introductory chapter in which she lays out the different paradoxes of globalization, and I've tried to provide you with a visualization of these and the ways in which we live in a moment where there's an opening yet a blocking, there's a desire or articulation of universal discourses, yet there's also exclusionary discourses, there's a move towards virtual networks, while there's also a need to construct barricades and so on and so forth. And in certain instances, these two discourses are sitting together in the same political party or even in the same figure, the political politician and the like. And so that's in and of itself is quite interesting. So there's a lot of really good stuff at the beginning here in which she lays out her thesis. In fact, there's quite a bit of repetition in the book in her laying out the particular thesis that she wants to articulate. So let's have a look at some of that. So she discusses, for example, page 25, on the theatricalized and spectacularized performance of sovereignty at the aspiration or actual national borders brings into relief the nation-state's sovereignty's theological remainder, its sort of legacy, its leftover. And that's very much in dialogue with the arguments of Schmidt throughout here. Okay, so what are some of the arguments that she makes? Well, she wants to argue that, or she discusses the ways in which sovereignty is described by Schmidt and by others. And it's got a series of different qualities in that it is territorial or spatial. It's supposed to be supreme. It is supposed to be protective. It's in perpetuity. It's absolutist. It's non-transferable. It's decisionist, and decisionist meaning that there are certain decisions made. There is a particular protector or god-like figure who decides on what to do, and because that person is making the decisions, therefore things get done, and the kind of mythos of sovereignty, at least in Rousseau and others, is that you have a social contract, and this also goes back to Hobbes. You have a social contract in which the people hand their particular representation to a sovereign, and the sovereign makes decisions on behalf of the community as a whole. So that's the kind of qualities of sovereignty. And what's important here is the ways in which they carry over from the older understanding of sovereignty as something as residing in a person, a sort of divine-like person, to then carries over into a more modern conception of sovereignty residing in the people, coming from the nation. Now, what she wants to look at is, and is kind of animated by, why is there a need to create walls in the contemporary period? Why is there a desire for walls? And she describes our current condition as a post-Westphalian one, in that we have the Westphalian system, which is created in 1648, or at least that's the mythos, that there is a point in which you have the breakdown of the sort of aspirations of the Universal Church, Universal Catholic Church in Europe. It's a sort of the moment when the Reformation gets tamed. That's a moment when states decide their own religion, and the sovereign within the state decides the religion of the community there. And that's the particular sort of deal that's struck that creates the Westphalian system. And the myth is that therefore you have territorial nation states. You have one territory, one community, one state. Now that doesn't ever really get realized in practice. The closest we get to it is sort of in the 20th century, but even that, and we're still sort of working this out. But with globalization, we are already aware that we are in an era where we're past that, and where borders are supposed to be less significant. We're in an era where we're supposed to have an appreciation of connectivity and community beyond the nation state. But as she points out, the post here is one that is not beyond. It is one that's still very much in the shadow of and very much pivoting around this myth of the Westphalian state. And she talks about the ways in which there is a certain irony to a post-Westphalian condition. You have the marked erosion of nation-state sovereignty, and at that very moment you have the desire to create walls. She doesn't think that is coincidental. Those two things are related as far as she's concerned. You have performative contradictions of this theatrical desire for sovereignty expressing itself in material forms, in the creation of walls. Yet there's also globalization occurring at the same time. You have a rise of condition of ungovernability, the ability of states to actually manage global change. Is significantly in question because of the technological innovations, because of the nature of the world that we live in. And so that's another feature of our contemporary condition. And then you have this blurring of the law and lawlessness as another feature of this post-Westphalian condition. So what is sovereignty in the 21st century? What is post-Westphalian sovereignty? What does it look like? And that's really the question that she's sort of asking here. Now, on the one hand, Hart and Negri give the answer, post-Westphalian sovereignty is global empire. It is a sort of an empire of governmentality based around neoliberalism, and based around a kind of a vision of the world as the United States. So it's very much an Americanized vision of how the world should be gone global, which involves notions of intervention and protection, responsibility to protect and the like. The alternative to that is what Agamben is arguing for, and that is that we live in a world where we have a permanent state of exception, where the law is suspended, where there's a strong divide between those that live in a condition of bare life and those that are protected. And the state is an interventionist one which intervenes to keep certain people in a condition of bare life and protect others. And she comes down on this by talking about the fact that today we have, in practical terms, sovereignty meaning the rule of oligarchic capitalist groups and also God, states acting in the name of God. And this is, of course, her book is pre-Trump, but Trump is sort of articulates this, or at least Trump-Pence articulates this, because Trump, on the one hand, is kind of a classic oligarch figure, who is internationalized. His business empire is international. His ties are made in China and elsewhere overseas. And yet he is, though a very, very unlikely figure to be someone who would underpin a theological conception of the state. He's nevertheless allied with the Christian right, and Mike Pence represents that alliance, and therefore you have the rule of the oligarchs and God talkers. Now, other states represent this too, and so you have Turkey, Iran, Israel, and so on and so forth, that combine in certain ways, and also Russia combine in certain ways these two qualities together. So that's what she points to. But it's a sort of it's not a fleshed out thesis, it's a particular argument that she makes in distinction to these others in the text. So those are some observations about the first chapter. Now the second chapter is really the theoretical engine of the book. And here she is engaging with Schmidt's work. And she's looking at the ways in which the meaning of sovereignty changes, that the idea of the sovereign becomes sovereignty as an abstraction, as a sort of imagination of popular rule, and that you have movement from divine sovereignty, where it is presumed that kind of the dominant fiction of the society is that the ruler is semi-divine and therefore represents God on earth, and therefore is sort of untouchable. So the idea of the Tsar, for example, or the Sultan, and the absolute right of kings in Europe. So that particular type of sovereignty, then giving over to state sovereign power, the development of the modern state, the kind of themes that Foucault develops. And this in part is about popular sovereignty. It's in part about the French Revolution and the locating of sovereignty in the people. But again, another sort of an abstraction is, well, who are the people and how do they exercise their particular sovereignty? And Schmidt really explores that in a very, very productive way. And then we're moving to this post-Westphalian condition, and that's the question in the book and the concern. What is the post-Westphalian condition of sovereignty? What does sovereignty mean in the contemporary period? Now, what unites all of these understandings of sovereignty is that sovereignty is always seen as sort of fictional. It is a story we tell ourselves about how our society is organized and how we give legitimacy to our political system. So there's a sort of fictional quality to it. There's a theatrical quality to it in terms of the display of this sovereignty. You know, the display of the divine right of kings, then the display of popular sovereignty with elections and so on and so forth, and the particular dates that are dates of commemoration of independence and freedom that are celebrated by various states, and then the contemporary period where we celebrate certain universal ideals and notions of universal human rights and so on and so forth, Women's Day, etc., etc. There's a posited universal commonality, and what she also argues, and this is something that Schmidt articulates too, is that there in constituting a sovereign community, there's a notion that the sovereign is protecting. The sovereign is a fatherly figure. The sovereign is containing. The sovereign is integrating and creating a community. And the sovereign is excluding otherness. And so in all of these instances, you have in the display of the notion of sovereignty, you have this occurring. So there is a sort of father principle, Führer principle, protective principle at work. And she throughout the book, particularly in the last chapter, comes back to this sort of primal notion of human vulnerability in a world of tremendous dangers and risks and uncertainties, and how that psychically, how humans process that by creating a sovereign, endowing a particular figure to look after them, to be the father protector, and that sort of that condition of infantile helplessness, which is a condition that all human beings experience, provides the foundations for this, a sort of at an unconscious level, the foundations for the notion of sovereignty. That's why it resonates with us, because we all want to have something to look up to. We all want the fantasy that someone is looking after us, that someone is protecting, and so on and so forth. Initially, that's a particular person, and then it becomes the state. And in the contemporary period, it is perhaps a super state or an alliance of states and sets of ideals, and a sort of a religious creed associated with human rights and so on and so forth. So this chapter discusses the nomos, which is this idea of enclosure as the sort of foundational moment of sovereignty. With enclosure, you have the creation of the law, you have the creation of the sacred and the sovereign, and all of those things in Schmidt's account are linked. And in so doing, in bounding, in the first act of creating the sovereignty is he who decides, and he who decides is the person who determines where the community ends, what is sacred and what is not, who are we as a community of friends, and who are our enemies. Now there's a discussion of how this is deeply territorial from the outset. So this is in Hobbes's work. This is in English history, particularly the colonization of Ireland, where the idea of beyond the pale, meaning that's the sort of the era of lawlessness, and that's a particular phrase which we have. But there actually was materially a geographic area, which I've shown here on the map, which was beyond the pale, and that was the area of the Irish Gaelic lords and wild peoples, according to the English settlers who were settling in the area of contemporary Dublin and Kildare and Meath. And there was actually a fence which marked out this 15th and 16th century polity, which then expanded out later in the 16th century, and the 17th century took over the whole island and cleared certain areas for settlement, particularly the Ulster plantation. All right, so that is the kind of discussion that you have in this particular chapter. Let me just point out that Agamben's work on the state of exception is in when you have the boundary between the law and the lawlessness begin to break down. And in fact, this comes out of Schmidt's work, and that is that he wants to argue that the development of the modern sovereign state as he who decides, it has a particular feature to it, and that is that the God sovereign and the state sovereign are both share this enclosure, this desire to create borders around things, to define an inside and an outside, and in Schmidt's terms, friend and enemy. But importantly for Schmidt, state sovereignty has a dual quality to it. We have the idealized sense of it, that it is sovereignty of the people, but he wants to point out that in actuality there is also the state itself, and there's a decisionist feature of the state, and that is those who are in charge of the state, who make decisions, who can deploy the army, who control the police and the like, and they have a vested interest themselves. That's part of modern state sovereignty. That's where sovereignty in Schmitt's terms really resides. It really resides with the person who decides, and that becomes the king and later the president or the prime minister, the person who is elected to ultimately be the protector. And part of the feature of the sovereign is that the sovereign gets to decide when to suspend the law. And the sovereign is above the law. The law does not apply to the sovereign because the sovereign guarantees the law, and the sovereign decides what the law is and what the law is not. So he who creates the state of exception is the sovereign, and that law depends upon a person or a figure being outside of the law in order to enforce it. So that particular paradox, which is in Schmitt, it's in political theory writ large, as she points out in this chapter, Schmitt takes out and kind of brings to the fore in a very provocative way. Because Schmitt is not a liberal. Schmitt is someone who is very critical of liberalism and sees it as very hypocritical in lots of ways because it does not recognize this particular dilemma. It does not recognize the need for a decider, the need for decisionism. And remember, Schmitt is reacting against the Weimar Republic, which was notoriously feckless in its inability to handle the crisis that afflicted post-war Germany, post-World War I Germany. So you have this dual quality to the to sovereignty in the modern era. Now, this then leads her to identify a series of different paradoxes with sovereignty. So let's discuss some of these. I have highlighted some parts of the text here, and I'm just kind of going to go through them and get to this section on these paradoxes. So this is page 53. So sovereignty is both a name for absolute power and a name for political freedom. And that's that dual quality. Sovereignty generates order through subordination and freedom through autonomy. Sovereignty has no internal essence, but rather is completely dependent and relational, even as it stands for autonomy, self-presence, and self-sufficiency. So there's always an outside. There is an other. There is across the border. There's a lawlessness which defines then the internal. Sovereignty produces both internal hierarchy and external anarchy. Both hierarchy and anarchy are at odds with democracy if the latter is understood as a modestly egalitarian sharing of power. Yet with rare exceptions, political theorists take sovereignty to be a necessary feature of political life. The very possibility of political action, political order, and political protection seems to depend on it. And then number 5, sovereignty is both a sign of the rule and jurisdiction of law and supervenes the law, or sovereignty is both the source of law and above the law, the origin of juridicalism and what resides outside it. It is all law and no law. Its every utterance is law, and it is lawless. Sovereignty is also both generated and generative. And then the theological aspect of sovereignty is the internal condition of the secular notion of the autonomy of the political articulated by and through sovereignty. And so she goes on to explain exactly what that means. So those are hard notions, perhaps, if you are not too familiar with political theory, but go with it. Give it a chance, so that you can get a lot out of this book. There is a lot in it. So let's talk about the state and what she is talking about in terms of what's happening when you go from a modern condition of sovereignty to post-Westphalian sovereignty. And that is the state in the Westphalian state. The myth of Westphalian state is that it contained economic networks which were previously transnational. It sort of defined an economy which was within the state. And it also contained religious networks which were previously universal. And there's always a tension between religion and the state, and in some instances that was worked out by the state establishing its own religion, so the Church of England being a classic example of this. The crown, she discusses the crown as currency, as a way in which the economic is mastered by the state. So you have that notion as being a sort of tilting of power away from the economic and the religious into the hands of the state, into the hands of the sovereign. Now you have a condition with globalization of decontainment, and that is those things which were previously contained, like religious networks, like economic networks, are suddenly strengthened again, and the state no longer seems like it is able to be sovereign relative to the appeal of religious networks. Now, this plays itself out really very obviously in Trump's America. So his critique of globalization is that globalization is eroding the foundations of the state. It is American carnage. It's a geopolitical catastrophe for the state. And then his attempt to institute a Muslim ban is sourced in the notion that the particular religious identity of one community, and this is an old ideal, an old prejudice, is therefore going to be much more significant than their loyalty to a particular community, to a particular territory in a particular community. So American Muslim, the Muslim is more important than the American in this particular instance. Now he's sort of refolding or redefining the state, United States in this instance, as Christian, as a Christian nation. So that's sort of return to a God, a particular vision of God. Though that the condition of decontainment is what she's discussing in this particular chapter. Chapter 3 deals with subjects and the nature of the subjects created by this condition of walling, this desire for walling. And she discusses the Minutemen, which are sort of self-appointed vigilante groups on the US border, the particular settler groups in Israel-Palestine, and the particular violence surrounding the creation of the borders and the desire to patrol and maintain borders. Now, there's a large literature on this, and there are various operations that are discussed in this literature. So the two that I would recommend to you, Eyal Weizman's book on the architecture of occupation in Israel-Palestine, and then Joseph Nevin's book, Operation Gatekeeper. And actually he has a subsequent book, Beyond Operation Gatekeeper. But that's the ways in which you have the emergence of, in biopolitical terms, of this the terrorist in the Hamas terrorist in the Israeli case, the suicide bomber, and then the illegal alien in the US as an other, which is creates the justification for this particular desire for these border walls. You have a discussion of Jersey barriers here and the ways in which this walling impulse is one that exceeds the border. It goes into cities and how we design cities. It's about gated communities. It's about creating a hardened space. And so the work of Stephen Graham is particularly interesting in this. His previous book was Cities Under Siege, and his new book is called Vertical, which is the city as an arena for stratification and hardening and class warfare in many instances in his analysis. So that is some of the points that are made in chapter 3 of the book. Here are some things that I have highlighted, and this is her claim. This is page 62. As the nation-state sovereignty wanes, both internal and external performances of it are increasingly and openly dressed in religious regalia. And that's the taken from Schmidt, the ways in which the religious is still very much powerful in our contemporary period. So these are the points that she makes here. Now, in this chapter 3, there's one section I want to draw your attention to, and that is the quote by Peter Andreas, where he, and this is where Wendy Brown uses his reaction to this trope, which is we hear again and again. We've lost control of our borders. We need to control our borders again. This is the sort of harangue of Nigel Farage in England, the leading Brexit campaigner, and of course of Donald Trump in the United States. And Andreas argues that this understates the degree to which the state has actually structured, conditioned, and even enabled, often unintentionally, clandestine border crossings, and overstates the degree to which the state has been able to control its borders in the past. And that is that particular powerful trope, lost control of our borders, has behind it a whole political economy which encourage cross-border movement. And then also has not only that, a failure to address that political economy, but also a mythos of the glorious past, the past when we were ourselves and there weren't so many outsiders. And so there's a sort of nostalgia which goes along with this particular claim that I think is important and part of the structure of feeling here in this particular instance. So chapter 4 deals with the psychic dimensions of the border, the will to bordering, and she outlines it here in the beginning of the chapter. The chapter argues that nation states walling respond in part to psychic fantasies, anxieties and wishes, and does so by generating visual effects and a national imaginary apart from what walls purport to do. Walls may be effective in producing this psychic containment even as they fail to block or repeal the transnational clandestine flows of people. So that's an important point. And essentially what she's saying is that these borders have a certain fetish-like quality to them. And Brown's feminist reading and background is very apparent in this particular chapter, where she is aware of the ways in which you have a subject here who is feeling a masculinity under stress, a masculinity under threat, and a desire to remasculinize, to put some steel in the border again. And so that is a particular psychic condition. It's a psychic condition grounded in masculinity and a hegemonic masculinity dominant within certain states, and that's certainly the case in many places. And it's a fetish. It is something that, even though we know that this doesn't work, it still satisfies at a certain level. And there is a phallic quality to the border, and how high the border is, and it's sort of a visually reassuring to certain groups, and that is part of what she argues here. And of course, all of this writing is prior to Trump. So she wrote this book in 2008 and 2009. And then Trump comes along and uses this particular notion to win the presidency. Now, in this chapter, she discusses various fantasies of wall democracy, and it's a really very provocative and interesting analysis. Here are the four that are listed: dangerous aliens, the idea of containment, fantasies of impermeability, and fantasies of purity, innocence, and goodness. So, for example, the idea that the American carnage would end when you build a border wall, and the American carnage may be the ravaging of American communities by heroin and drugs. And the notion is that if we just cut off the supply at the wall by building a wall, therefore we can somehow restore our health, our purity, and our innocence. And of course that is completely counterintuitive, in as much as the reason why there are drugs going across the border in the first place is because of the massive demand for them in the United States. And that demand comes from addiction and dependency, and that in and of itself is something that's not examined. It's the failure of that, what that says about U.S. society, is projected onto to the outside, to Mexico. The problem is Mexican drug cartels and dealers and so on and so forth. And it's fairly straightforward and kind of empirically evident. But psychically, it is not appealing in this as walls are appealing to a certain group as solutions. The very end of this chapter, she discusses the ways in which walls are meant to awe, that they are sort of temples in post-Westphalian sovereignty, that and of course there are connections. You think of the Wailing Wall in Jerusalem, and then the barrier walls just not that far from the Wailing Wall, and the Wailing Wall being the most sacred site of Judaism, and how walls today have a certain sacredness associated with them. And she provides us with a reading of Freud to talk about the ways in which they are these kind of objects that create awe and that are seen as sort of solutions to conditions of helplessness. So let's talk about some problems with Wendy Browns' book. This is political theory, and political theory versus social science, these things don't often go well together. So there are a lot of speculative abstractions of theory here, and there's not that much or less discussion of empirical history. So contrast that to Rhys Jones's work, and you'll get some sense of the ways in which Jones's work is based upon field work, it's based upon document analysis, it's based upon statistics, as well as reading of the particular discourse and being attentive to the powers that be. Brown's work is grounded in political theory. She's engaging in debates with other political theorists, and she is taking certain quotes from figures, often very effectively, but the degree to which these quotes may actually be cherry-picked, the degree to which the statistics that she cites, which are sort of loose, that is problematic for some within social science. There's a certain elegance of the theory which potentially obscures messy realities, that things are not so cut and dried as she presents. And then there would be people who would push back against what they see as a forced feminist reading of borders, seeing them as symbolic compensation for castration, for loss, from conditions of helplessness. There's a tendency, perhaps a tendency towards overstatement. That comes with the territory, so to speak, of political theory. The arguments she makes that walls don't work, of course, is not well accepted. I mean, they work for certain groups at certain times on certain issues, and while she is probably correct in the abstract, they may nevertheless work in certain ways. Now, the big issue, of course, is suicide bombings in Israel, and the degree to which the wall stopped those or responsible for the drop in suicide bombings is very contentious, and is not to say suicide bombing stopped because the wall was created, I think is simplifying too much, but one has to nevertheless take into consideration the wall as one factor in that. The last problem is a problem which is very evident in the last chapter, and that is it's a very provocative and interesting chapter. But what it does is that posits a hegemonic subject, a masculine subject, as being the nation. There's a sort of unitary psyche, and that psyche is the nation. And of course, in one sense, there's no evidence for that. Donald Trump is the nation. Donald Trump was the person that managed to win the US presidency in 2016. But there's massive resistance to Trump. There's no discussion of the resistance of disaggregating the nation into different interest groups, discussing Mexican Americans, discussing lots of people who are pushing back against this desire for the wall. Now, that is, I think, in response, what she would say is that nevertheless, these things are popular. The politicians who champion them win elections. The funds get appropriated in Congress, even though this doesn't work. Even figures like John McCain, who are from the border states and are aware of the limitations of borders, nevertheless will vote for these things because they satisfy the majority of his electorate, and that's not a bad response. So that is one way in which there is this is convincing, that this resonates. And remember, again, written in 2009, published 2010, and it reads as if it was written in 2016. Okay, so that is a discussion of Wendy Browns' provocative book, Walled States, Waning Sovereignty. I've only touched on some of it. The lecture is not a substitute for actually reading the text, which is very, very interesting, and I hope you enjoy it. Okay, thank you, and I will stop here.